The chime from her phone was deceptively soft. An elegant, simple tone Imani had chosen herself, one that was supposed to signify something mundane. A message from a friend. A reminder for an appointment. Instead, it felt like the snap of a tripwire. She was in her studio, the air thick with the scent of linseed oil and old paper, her fingers stained with pigment. A 17th-century scroll lay unfurled on the long table, its delicate silk demanding a level of focus that left no room for the outside world. But the chime broke the spell. A second one followed, then a third. A rapid, insistent staccato of digital alerts. Imani set down her finest brush, the one with bristles made from weasel hair, and wiped her hands on a clean cloth. Her phone screen was lit up with notifications from her bank. Each one was a fresh wound. Transaction alert. $25,00000. The Gilded Lily Banquet Hall. Transaction alert. $12. 85,000. Petals and Promises Floral Design. Transaction alert. $32,00000.
Vera Wing.
Her breath caught in her throat. The numbers were obscene, impossible. She tapped open the app, her thumb trembling slightly. The balance on the account, the one that was supposed to be her private buffer, her safety, was hemorrhaging money. The card linked to it, the one she kept locked in a safe in her bedroom, the one she never used, was being drained in a different time zone, an ocean away. There was only one explanation. One group of people who knew the card existed, who had seen her place it in that safe the last time she'd been forced to visit home. Her family. Her sister, Tara, was getting married this weekend. A wedding Imani had been explicitly, painfully uninvited from. "It's just for close family, Imani," her mother had said, the lie thin as tracing paper. "You've been gone so long, you understand. You wouldn't know anyone." She had swallowed the bitterness, accepted the rejection as she always had. It was the price of her escape, the cost of the life she had built for herself in Tokyo, a life of quiet precision and beautiful, broken things that she could mend. A life under the gilded, dangerous protection of Kaito Tanaka, her husband. A cold dread, colder than the winter air outside her window, seeped into her bones. This wasn't her money. Not really. It was his. Everything she had was his. The sprawling, minimalist penthouse overlooking Shinjuku Gyoen, the clothes in her closet, the studio filled with priceless art he tasked her with restoring. Even the bank account, a gift he'd given her on their first anniversary. "For your independence," he had said, his voice a low murmur that held no warmth but promised absolute security. It was a test of her loyalty, she knew. A chain forged from platinum and trust. And her family had just snapped it. Her phone began to ring. The screen displayed no number, only a single, stark character.
His crest.
The symbol of his clan. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. He never called. He communicated through his lieutenants, through polite, sterile text messages, or in the dead of night when he returned to their bed, smelling of cold air and something metallic she refused to name. A direct call meant one of two things, a declaration of war, or a breach in his defenses. She answered, her voice barely a whisper. "Hello." Imani. His voice was exactly as she remembered, yet amplified by the phone. It was stripped of any illusion of humanity. It was pure control. Cold, polished steel. He said her name not like a question, but like a statement of ownership. Kaito. Silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. He was waiting. He knew. Of course he knew. A man like Kaito Tanaka, whose empire was built on information and the brutal suppression of weakness, would have systems in place that monitored every yen that flowed through his world. The transactions would have been flagged instantly. "There have been several large, unscheduled withdrawals from your discretionary account," he stated. It wasn't an accusation. It was a fact laid bare between them, like a body on an autopsy table. In America. At establishments catering to a wedding. "I know," she said, her voice shaking despite her efforts to keep it steady. "I just saw." Explained, the single word was a command, absolute and unforgiving. It's my sister's wedding, she began, the words tasting like ash. I think they took the card. The last time I was there. They must have. Another silence. Longer this time. In it, she could picture him perfectly. Sitting in an office of dark wood and smoked glass, his suit of flawless armor of dark gray wool. One hand, the one with the dragon tattoo coiling from his wrist to his knuckles, would be resting on the desk, perfectly still. His eyes, dark and intelligent, would be narrowed, calculating angles she couldn't possibly comprehend. He wasn't just calculating the loss of the money. The money was nothing. He was calculating the insult, the disrespect, the vulnerability it represented. Your family, he said, the words clipped. The ones who do not speak to you. Yes, humiliation burned hot in her chest. He knew about her family. He knew everything. Before he had proposed their arranged marriage, a strategic alliance to give his clan a respectable, international face while he consolidated power, he had presented her with a file. It was a full dossier on her life, including the long, painful history of being the quiet, artistic outcast in a family of loud, grasping people who saw her only as a failure or a resource. He had seen her deepest shame and had never mentioned it again. Until now. They believe they can steal from me, he said. The temperature of the statement was absolute zero. It wasn't about her.
It was about him.
They had reached into his territory, into his home, and taken something that belonged to him. By extension, they had stolen from the Tanakagumi. I will pay it back, she said quickly, desperately. I can sell some of the pieces I've restored on the private market. I can. No, he cut her off. The word was final. You will do nothing. The debt is not yours to settle. It is a matter of honor. A new, more potent fear began to bloom inside her. She knew what his matters of honor looked like. She had seen the aftermath. The quiet men in dark suits who appeared and disappeared, the rivals who were suddenly reported to have retired to the countryside. Kaido, please, she whispered. They're stupid. They don't understand. They're my family. They cease to be your family when they put their hands on what is mine, he replied. I am returning to Tokyo. We will discuss this when I arrive tomorrow evening. Do not leave the penthouse. The line went dead. Imani stood frozen in the quiet of her studio, the phone still pressed to her ear. The silence he left behind was louder than his voice had been. He was coming home, not to the silent, separate life they usually led, passing each other like ghosts in the grand, empty apartment. He was coming home to deal with this, with her, with the mess her broken past had dragged into his pristine, violent world. The unfurled scroll on her table seemed to mock her. A priceless piece of history, fragile but enduring. She mended things. She took what was broken and made it whole again, patiently, carefully. But this was a tear she didn't know how to fix. This was a debt that could only be paid in a currency she didn't possess. A currency of blood and fear. And her husband, the most dangerous man in Tokyo, was the one who would set the price. The next 24 hours were the longest of her life. She couldn't work. The delicate brush felt clumsy in her hand, her focus shattered. Every shadow in the penthouse seemed to lengthen, every creak of the building a premonition. She paced the length of the vast living room, the floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of a city that glittered with a billion lights, each one a life utterly separate from her own. She was a curator in a museum of a life that wasn't hers, and she'd just broken the most valuable exhibit. When the front door finally opened, the sound was so quiet she almost missed it. He moved with a predatory grace that defied his size, absorbing sound. She turned from the window, her heart a cold stone in her chest. Kaido stood in the entryway, shrugging off his long cashmere coat and handing it to a subordinate who melted back into the hallway. He wore a black suit tailored with surgical precision, a white shirt and no tie. The top button was undone, revealing the edge of the intricate ink that covered his chest and arms, a tapestry of myths and monsters. He looked tired, the skin around his eyes drawn tight, but his presence filled the cavernous room, changing the very quality of the air. It became heavier, charged. His eyes found hers across the marble floor. They were dark, unreadable pools that missed nothing. He didn't speak, just watched her, his expression a mask of cold neutrality.
That was his way.
He used silence as a weapon, forcing others to fill it, to reveal themselves in their haste and anxiety.
She would not give him that.
She lifted her chin, meeting his gaze. "You're back." "I am," he said, his voice a low rumble. He walked toward her, not fast, but with an unnerving deliberation. He stopped a few feet away, close enough that she could smell the faint, clean scent of cypress and smoke that always clung to him. "Have you eaten?" The question was so unexpected it threw her off balance. "What?" "It is late. You have not eaten." It was another statement of fact. He had probably asked the household staff. "I wasn't hungry. You will eat." He gestured toward the dining area, where a simple meal of miso soup, grilled fish, and rice had been set for two. It was a command, not an invitation. They sat opposite each other at the long, polished table, the silence stretching between them. She picked at her food, her stomach a tight knot of anxiety. He ate with an economy of motion, his focus entirely on his meal. It was another form of control, of discipline. When he was finished, he placed his chopsticks down neatly and folded his hands on the table. He looked at her, and the weight of his gaze was a physical thing. "Tell me about your sister," he said. Imani blinked. "My sister?" "Tara," he supplied, the name sounding foreign and harsh in his mouth. "She is the one getting married." "Yes," she swallowed. "She's allowed. Ambitious. She always wanted a big, perfect life. The kind you see in magazines." "And your mother?" "Your father?" She hesitated, then spoke the truth. "They always saw me as a disappointment. Quiet, bookish. I liked museums more than parties. They didn't know what to do with me. Tara was their star. I was the shadow she cast." The admission felt like peeling back a layer of skin, exposing something raw and tender to his clinical gaze. He listened without interruption, his expression unchanging. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "They were fools," he said finally, the judgment delivered with the flat finality of a gavel strike. "To mistake quiet for weakness. To discard a jewel because they only value polished glass." Her breath hitched. It was the closest he had ever come to a compliment, or perhaps something more. An observation. An acknowledgement that he saw her, truly saw her, in a way her own blood never had. "The money is a trifle," he continued, his voice dropping lower. "But the message it sends is not. My enemies are always watching. They look for any crack in the armor, any sign of internal discord. A large, unauthorized expenditure from my household suggests a lack of control. It suggests weakness. It invites challenge." Now she understood. This wasn't just about his honor. It was about his survival. Her family's petty theft had painted a target on his back. "What are you going to do?" she asked, her voice small. "My man in Chicago is already handling it," he said calmly. "He will attend the wedding reception. He will retrieve the funds, along with a penalty for the disrespect. And he will deliver a message." "A message?" she repeated, dread coiling in her gut. "That you are Tanaka Imani," he said, his eyes locking onto hers. "That your name is my name. And that any insult to you is an insult to my entire organization. They will understand their mistake. It will not be repeated." The possessiveness in his tone was terrifying, but beneath it, there was something else. Something fiercely protective. He wasn't just defending his property. He was defending her. He stood up.
"Come."
He led her not to the bedroom, but to a part of the penthouse she rarely entered. His study. The room was lined with ancient books and artifacts, a stark contrast to the modern minimalism of the rest of the home. In the center of the room, on a velvet pedestal, was a single katana, its lacquered sheath gleaming in the low light. He walked to a cabinet and unlocked it. He pulled out a thick file, identical to the one he had shown her on her own life. He slid it across the polished desk toward her. There was a name on it, written in Japanese characters she couldn't read, but below it, in English, Tanaka Akemi. "My older sister," he said, his voice devoid of its usual iron control. For the first time, she heard a flicker of something else.
Something that sounded like pain.
Imani opened the file. Inside were photos of a young woman with Kaido's eyes, but a smile that reached them. She was beautiful, vibrant. There were reports, documents, letters. She pieced the story together. Akemi had fallen in love with a man outside the clan, a simple university professor. Their father, the former head of the family, had forbidden it. It was a stain on their honor. When she refused to end it, he had disowned her, cast her out with nothing. Kaido, then just a young lieutenant, had been powerless to stop him. She was the heart of our family, Kaido said, his back to her as he stared out the window at the city lights. She saw the good in people. She believed in honor, but also in love. Our father saw only the code. He chose the clan over his own blood. He broke her. Imani read the last entry in the file. A death certificate. Akemi had taken her own life a year after being exiled. I was not strong enough to protect her, Kaido continued, his voice a raw whisper. I swore that day that I would never be that weak again. That I would build an empire so strong, so absolute, that I could protect what is mine from anyone. From anything. He turned to face her, and in his eyes, she saw it. The wound he carried. The shame that drove him. He wasn't just a monster forged in violence. He was a man haunted by a failure he could never undo. He saw in her family's betrayal a twisted echo of his own father's. He saw another woman he cared for being harmed by the people who were supposed to love her. They will not break you, Imani, he said, his voice regaining its certainty. I will not allow it. In that moment, standing in the heart of his power, surrounded by the ghosts of his past, Imani made a choice. She could have been afraid. She could have seen him as a cage, his protection just another form of ownership. But what she felt instead was a strange, terrifying sense of belonging. He understood the particular pain of being rejected by your own blood. He understood what it was to be alone. She closed the file and walked toward him. She stopped just before him, looking up into his guarded face. Thank you, she said softly. He frowned, a flicker of confusion in his eyes. For what? For seeing me. She didn't run. She stayed. And that was the moment everything changed. The lines of their arrangement began to blur, the space between them shrinking until it was filled with a tension that was no longer just about fear or duty. It was something far more dangerous. A week later, the first tremor hit. Kaido was in a meeting with his lieutenants in the downstairs portion of the penthouse when a rival clan, the Sadokai, made their move. They didn't launch a frontal assault. They were smarter than that. They targeted the art gallery where Imani was consulting on a new exhibit. She was in the back room, examining a fragile Edo period screen, when the gallery owner, a nervous man named Mr. Edo, burst in, his face pale. They're here, he stammered.
Men. They're asking for you.
Imani's blood ran cold. She knew instantly. This was the challenge Kaido had predicted. The Sadokai had interpreted the story of the stolen money, a story that had undoubtedly slithered through the underworld grapevine, as a sign of chaos in the Tanakagumi. They were testing the fences, and she was the bait. She thought fast. Her mind, so used to the patient, methodical process of restoration, clicked into a different gear. Survival. The service exit. Where does it lead? To the alley, Edo whispered, wringing his hands. But they will have it covered. They're not here to kill me, she said, her voice surprisingly calm. Not yet. They're here to take me. To make a point, she looked around the storage room. Crates of chemicals, solvents, thinners. Things for her work. Things that were flammable. She grabbed a can of turpentine and a heavy rag. Barricade this door after I leave. Don't open it for anyone but my husband. She didn't wait for his reply. Slipping out the back, she found herself in a narrow, grimy alley. As predicted, two men in ill-fitting suits stood by the dumpster, blocking the exit to the street. They saw her and grinned, revealing stained teeth. Imani didn't hesitate. She uncapped the can, doused the rag in the volatile liquid, and threw it at a pile of overflowing cardboard boxes near them. Before they could react, she pulled a small lighter from her pocket, one she used for melting wax seals on special shipments, and flicked it on. She tossed it onto the soaked cardboard. The result was instantaneous. A whoosh of flame erupted, a wall of sudden, acrid smoke and fire that made the men stagger back, shouting in surprise. It wasn't a real weapon, but it was a diversion. It was chaos. And in chaos, there was opportunity. She sprinted in the opposite direction, down the length of the alley, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She heard them recovering, yelling curses, their footsteps pounding after her. The alley ended in a high, chain-link fence topped with barbed wire. A dead end. She was trapped. She turned, her back pressed against the cold metal, as the two men advanced, their grins replaced by angry sneers. One of them pulled a knife. Her diversion had only bought her seconds, and it had made them angry. That is when she made the mistake of looking past them. At the mouth of the alley, a black sedan had screeched to a halt. The back door flew open and Kaito emerged. He wasn't wearing a suit jacket, just his crisp white shirt, the sleeves rolled up to his forearms, revealing the dense, powerful ink that writhed on his skin with every movement. He moved like a phantom, silent and lethal. The two thugs hadn't even noticed him yet. They were too focused on her. Kaito closed the distance in a blur of motion. The first man turned at the last second, his eyes widening in shock. Kaito's hand shot out, grabbing the man's knife wrist and twisting it with a sickening crack of bone. The man screamed, dropping the blade. Kaito didn't pause. He drove his other fist into the man's throat, a short, precise, brutal strike. The man collapsed, gagging. The second thug lunged, but it was like a child attacking a storm. Kaito sidestepped, moving inside the man's clumsy swing, and drove an elbow into his ribs. As the man doubled over, gasping, Kaito brought the edge of his hand down on the back of his neck. The man dropped like a stone and didn't move. It was over in less than 5 seconds. A dance of surgical violence, terrifying in its efficiency. Kaito stood over the two unconscious forms, his chest rising and falling slightly. He didn't look at them. His eyes, burning with a cold fire she had never seen before, were fixed on her. He walked toward her, his gaze sweeping over her, checking for injury. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice rough. "No," she breathed, still pressed against the fence. Her whole body was shaking with adrenaline. He reached her, stopping so close she could feel the heat radiating from him. He lifted a hand, and for a heart-stopping second, she thought he was going to strike her for her recklessness. Instead, his fingers brushed a smudge of soot from her cheek, his touch surprisingly gentle. His eyes searched hers, and the mask was gone. In its place was a raw, unguarded emotion, a stark, terrifying fear. "I thought I had lost you," he said, the words torn from him, a confession far more intimate than any declaration of love. Imani looked at him, at this lethal, beautiful, broken man who had torn apart two others to protect her. She looked at the bodies on the ground and felt no remorse, only a fierce, possessive relief. She had crossed a line back there in the alley, using her quiet knowledge to create violence. She had met his world halfway. "You didn't," she whispered. "And you won't." He rested his forehead against hers, closing his eyes for a brief moment. The silence between them was not empty. It was filled with the truth they could no longer deny. She was not just a part of his empire. She was its center. And the war for her had just begun. The final confrontation came a month later. The Sadokai, humiliated and enraged, did something no one expected. They didn't come for Kaito. They came for her, but not with force. They used a scalpel. They found her father. Kaito's man in Chicago had delivered the message. Her family was terrified into silence. The money returned with a hefty penalty. But her father, weak and greedy, saw a new opportunity. The Sadokai offered him a fortune to lure his daughter into a trap. And he accepted. The call came from her mother, hysterical and weeping. Her father had a heart attack. He was in a private clinic in Kyoto. He was asking for her. It was a clumsy, obvious lie, but it was one aimed at a daughter's lingering sense of duty. Imani told Kaido immediately. He saw the trap for what it was. "They know I will not let you go alone," he said, his face grim. "They want me on their territory. Isolated." "What do we do?" she asked. "We go," he said simply. "But we do not go alone." The clinic in Kyoto was a traditional building, all serene gardens and paper screens. It felt like a stage set for a tragedy. Kaido's men, disguised as patients and orderlies, had swept the building, but the Sadokai were masters of their own territory. They met her father in a private room. He looked pale, but it was from fear, not illness. The moment she saw him, she knew. Behind a screen, a shadow moved. Sado, the old, withered head of the rival clan, stepped out, flanked by his two most brutal enforcers. "Tanaka-san," Sado said, his voice like dry leaves skittering across pavement. "And his beautiful, foreign wife. Your father was kind enough to arrange this meeting." Kaido placed himself slightly in front of Imani, a subtle, protective shift. "You have made a grave mistake, Sado-san." "Have I?" Sado smiled, a chilling, reptilian expression. "I think not. You showed weakness. Your house is in disarray. This woman, she is a cancer. We are simply cutting it out." One of the enforcers lunged for Imani. But she was ready. She had spent the last month learning from Kaido's head of security. Not just how to fight, but how to see, how to anticipate. She had noticed the slight bulge under the man's jacket, the way his eyes kept darting to a specific point on the wall. An alarm. As he reached for her, she didn't retreat. She moved forward, stamping her heel down hard on his instep. As he grunted in pain, she grabbed his arm, using his own momentum to spin him directly into the path of his partner. At the same time, she screamed. Now. It was the signal. The paper screens on the walls ripped open as Kaido's men poured into the room. The trap had been sprung, but not on them. The fight was swift and brutal. In the chaos, Imani's father tried to scramble away, but Sado grabbed him, holding a knife to his throat. "Call them off, Tanaka," he shrieked. Kaido, who had just disarmed Sado's last man, turned slowly. His face was a mask of cold fury. He looked at Sado, then at Imani's father, a man who had sold his own daughter. He made a decision. A cost would be paid. "He is not my family," Kaido said, his voice echoing in the sudden silence.
"He is yours now, Sado."
A traitor is fitting company for a snake. He took a deliberate step toward Imani, away from the hostage situation, making his choice clear. Sado stared, his leverage gone. In that split second of hesitation, one of Kaido's men fired a single, precise shot. Sado dropped, his hand releasing the knife. Imani's father crumpled to the floor, sobbing. The aftermath was quiet. Kaido's men were efficient, cleaning up the scene, removing the bodies and the traitors. Kaido walked over to Imani, ignoring her whimpering father completely. He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs tracing her cheekbones. "You are magnificent," he whispered, his voice thick with an emotion she couldn't name.
Pride. Awe.
Possession. She acted decisively in the climax. She was never rescued passively. She leaned into his touch, her choice made, irrevocable and absolute. Later that night, back in the penthouse in Tokyo, she was in her studio. She was cleaning the Edo screen from the gallery, her hands steady, her mind calm. The world outside was violent and uncertain, but in here, with her art, she could restore order. Kaido entered, silent as always. He didn't speak, just stood in the doorway, watching her. He had a dark bruise high on his cheekbone, the only visible sign of the battle. He had paid a cost, shedding blood and sacrificing a piece of his cold control to ensure her safety. He finally walked to her, his eyes on her careful, skilled hands. "You are the heart of this house, Imani," he said, his voice low and certain. "Without you, it is just stone and glass." It was his acknowledgement of what she was to him. No longer deniable, no longer hidden. He reached out, his hand covering hers. His fingers were calloused, his knuckles scarred. The hand of a warrior, A killer, a king. But his touch on her skin was gentle, a silent oath. He was her husband. This was her home. This violent, beautiful, dangerous life was theirs. And she would not have it any other way.